about the context for change and some elements of the change program, and then I'd be available to answer whatever questions you might like to ask of me in relation to the change program. So hopefully that will work for everyone. The first point that I want to make is that diplomacy matters. It matters to New Zealand as a trading nation. It matters to New Zealand as a nation which has historically and will in the future make a significant contribution on the international stage. And so the way in which we organise our diplomatic effort also matters for New Zealand. And so the changes that we are proposing in the document that we're consulting with our people about reflect very careful consideration. They reflect many years of reports that have been undertaken by former secretaries, by others within the ministry, into ways in which the ministry can work better. They reflect the results of a lot of work by senior members of the ministry team, both in the corporate support area and in the diplomatic area, looking at ways in which we can ensure that our diplomatic activity is focused, is efficient, is effective, and makes a real difference for New Zealand. So the proposals that we're talking to our people about are essentially about four things. They're about creating more flexibility in the way in which we manage diplomatic activity. Flexibility in the way that we're represented offshore, using non-resident ambassadors, for example, using smaller posts offshore than the traditional large diplomatic effort, to ensure we don't have a one-size-fits-all approach to diplomacy, and to ensure that we have appropriate representation and flexible representation that enables us to respond quickly to changing circumstances and identifying opportunities and mitigating risks. It's about using new technologies, well, not that new now, but using contemporary technologies to simplify processes, to give our people in the field the tools they need to be effective, and to ensure that this ministry is run as efficiently as we possibly can. It's about deepening expertise, because the reality is that New Zealand, as a nation of 4 million people, in a world of many, many, many billions, is challenged to get its voice heard. And it's not simply about building relationships, it's also turning up with something to say, turning up with real expertise in areas that matter to issues confronting New Zealand. And so the proposals talk about ways in which we can deepen the expertise of our people. And in particular, they talk about changes to the way in which people are employed in the ministry. Traditionally, we have employed them on a rotational basis, moving them every 2 or 3 years in the roles in which they're undertaking, to a model which is far more conventional, where they are appointed to roles and stay in those roles until they apply for and are successful in being appointed to a subsequent role. The benefits, obviously, in that are first, that people stay long enough to learn. They stay long enough to make mistakes and learn from them. Second, that we ensure that people are in jobs and paid for jobs and recognised in jobs on the basis of the job they're doing, rather than the traditional model, which has recognised them on the basis of their status in the ministry. And third, we create opportunity, particularly for our younger people with ambition and energy, to be able to advance more quickly in the ministry than has traditionally been the way in which careers have been managed. So expertise and flexibility are really important. Affordability is, of course, important to New Zealanders as well, particularly in this current environment with the global financial crisis, with the challenges in Europe, and with the cost of the Christchurch earthquake and other tragedies that we have to fund. It's important that we are as affordable as we possibly can be. And what we're looking to do in relation to affordability is make sure that our processes, our back office activities are as efficient as they can be. So we are looking at outsource options, we are looking at hubbing options, we are looking at doing our work differently, both here in Wellington and offshore. And if, as a consequence of using new technologies for global document management, for example, for e-records, for universal online banking, for financial management, for a range of other component pieces of the support jigsaw, we can provide better service to our posts and more efficiently manage those posts to provide savings to New Zealanders, then we are very keen to do that. And these proposals recommend or propose that we pursue those sorts of outsourcing options. One particular outsourcing option that's identified in the proposal is the idea that we would set up a 24/7 call centre based here in New Zealand to manage calls, particularly consular calls, into our network. The thinking there is not simply that that will take a lot of call volume away from posts and free them up to focus on other things that matter, but more importantly, that people will get a consistent service that will be able to log and manage and triage calls in an appropriate way, and will be able to ensure that an appropriate level of response is given to the particular circumstance that any individual New Zealander is describing. So at the end of these changes, what we are looking to have is a flexible, fit-for-purpose, deeply expert ministry which can prosecute New Zealand's interests internationally in the 21st century. Now, we are also looking at changing some elements of our remuneration packages. In particular, we have two principles that we have been looking at. The first is that people should neither be advantaged nor disadvantaged when they are offshore or onshore. So we're trying to get some equity between the onshore and offshore positions. And as you may know, the current reality is that there is significant advantage for many people in being offshore. Now that creates real challenges for us in managing the sort of flexible movement of people backwards and forwards from Wellington to offshore in the way that we would like to in the 21st century ministry. So there are proposals in the material that have gone to our staff which would see us rebalance between the offshore and onshore components. That sees us increase base salaries here in Wellington, where we've fallen well behind our desired position, which is the 50th percentile for the public service. So it sees us move to address that imbalance. And it sees us adjust some of the offshore allowances, in particular allowances in relation to support for children and families, not in the context of providing education support, which we will continue to, not in the context of providing housing support, which we will continue to, not in the context of providing health or utility support, but simply taking an allowance which we've traditionally had and which is now quite uncommon, to pay people a 20% loading if they have a partner and a 7.5% loading if they have for each child, and eliminating that particular proposal. What we are also looking to do is ask our people offshore to make a nominal contribution to the costs of their living and utility, based on New Zealand costs, based on a representative figure for relevant costs in New Zealand. Now, of course, in most places, the costs will be significantly higher. The actual costs will be significantly higher. The ministry will continue to meet those costs. But from our point of view, the principle of balancing offshore and onshore, and the other key principle, which is about ensuring that we pay people for the job that they are doing, not for their status or for their wider circumstances, underpin the proposals that we have put to our people. So the situation that we are proposing is to create a smaller ministry. There's been some publicity about figures. The proposal would see us have 305 fewer positions in the ministry, and of those, 169 are roles for staff here and overseas, and 136 are roles for locally engaged staff. The locally engaged staff roles are coming out largely as a consequence of the work that they are doing changing. So if you do the global document management, you do the e-records, you do the consular call centre, you do the finance, you do the property management in an outsourced hub or different way, then there simply is not the work that requires that number of people in our offshore posts. In relation to our onshore posts, what we are doing is altering and changing how we provide corporate support in the ministry, which is seeing part of the reduction, and we are also reducing in a minor way the number of diplomats that we have in the network, the number of foreign policy people we have in the network. Two reasons. The first is that we are reshaping the way we are represented in Europe. We are looking to move over time to a far more hubbed concept for delivering representation in Europe out of Brussels and Berlin, rather than being represented in every capital. And the second is that we've looked at the span of control that our sort of deputy director level people have, and we recognise that we don't need the same number of people at that level, given the size of the units that people are being asked to lead. So what we're describing to people is a reshaped ministry. It is a smaller ministry, but it is a ministry that has the capacity to deliver for New Zealand, and it is a ministry that has real opportunity still for people of talent to be able to achieve their potential. In terms of the financial impacts of the saving of the proposals that we are making, the financial impacts, were they to be all accepted, would be $20 to $25 million a year at the bottom line for the ministry. So that's the sort of net impacts of all of those processes that I've just described. Of course, as I said at the start, this is a proposal. It is not a done deal. Our staff have, of course, many of them been very involved in the way in which this proposal has been put together, but we are expecting that we will get constructive feedback from across our network about the sorts of things we're proposing, and we will get other ideas from people about other ways in which we might take the ministry forward. So we're open to all of that. People have a month to provide that feedback to us, and we, together with the people of the ministry, are looking forward to ensuring that this ministry can deliver for New Zealand across all the metrics, all the areas that the people of New Zealand require from us.
Have you talked to the government about this yet?
Yes.
And what's their view of these proposals?
Well, I think Mr McCulley has said in a press release that he has released that he thinks they are careful and I'm trying to think of the exact language, Barry, but I think he said that they are careful and a good sort of step in the right direction.
Getting to the $25 million worth you're expected to save from these cuts, the government wanted to see budget cuts of up to $40 million. Does that mean further cuts are likely?
I think that the proposals that we are making provide a flexible and affordable ministry for the government and people of New Zealand. We will, of course, continue to look for other ways in which we can be more efficient. And in particular, the proposal that is currently out for consultation recognises that further changes in areas such as IT, HR and property are likely. The reason that those changes are not being consulted at the moment is that our IT team are up to their necks in rolling out the technology platforms that will be used to support the new environment which I've just described. Our HR team are, of course, extraordinarily busy in supporting our people through this change process, and the property team similarly are very busy in managing the procurement process around the outsourcing proposals that we are outlining. So we are anticipating, to your question, that there will be further change, and that is set out in the document that our staff have received today.
Effectively you've cut about half of the required budget. So would it be fair to assume that there'll be more job losses on top of that proposed 305?
Well, what the proposal document signals is that we do expect that we will be able to reshape the areas that I've just described, HR, IT and property, once we have the underlying change process that we're just commencing completed, and that there will be opportunities for reduction in staff as a consequence of that. If I just take a couple of examples for you. In the HR space, the elimination of rotation in itself, remember I talked about the fact that we are proposing to stop rotating people. Currently we have about 12 or 13 people who are in place to support that rotation effort. And obviously we won't need all of those people in a new environment. So the point I'm making is that there will be further opportunity and we will continue to seek those opportunities as we move forward.
They start
feel
having
like
a
we've
month,
just
start
created
having a month
false-
to submit and have the ideas for when a final decision is going to be made.
We expect to make final decisions or release the final decision document on the 10th of April.
And this 24/7 phone line you're talking about, do any other countries do that around the world, and how do you know it will be successful?
Well, lots of other people use call centres, of course, and lots of other organisations manage on an international basis calls and customer relations through call centres. So I've got no doubt that it can be successful. There are heaps of organisations that do this. There's no reason at all why it can't be successful for us. And indeed, as I've said, we believe that New Zealanders will get a better service as a consequence of this, and that we will be able to, as well, be more efficient in providing that service.
But do other foreign affairs ministries do it?
There are other foreign affairs ministries that have done some of these things, yes. In fact, just about everything that we are proposing has been done by some foreign affairs ministry, or they're experimenting with it, or they're looking at it. So, outsourcing of property, use of call centres, all of these sorts of things, because we're not alone in this world and in this sort of challenging environment that we're faced in looking for different ways in which we can deliver services. So, to answer your question, there are other foreign ministries that are engaged in exactly the process that we're engaged in and are exploring exactly the same sorts of options.
Do you think an 0800 number will go far enough to help a New Zealander who's hospitalised or imprisoned in the country, as opposed to sending someone from the embassy?
No, absolutely not. What it will do is it will enable us to triage those calls so that those calls that are not of that serious nature and can be handled efficiently by somebody in New Zealand are handled efficiently in New Zealand, and the people that need specific support from the embassy will be able to be supported from the embassy.
How will people be affected by the change to specialist positions rather than rotational positions? Are they going to have to apply for those specialist positions, and how many people does that affect?
That's right, they will need to apply for those specialist positions, and that's why the change process, even though the actual number of positions that are impacted I've already described, but that's why we will have about 600 of our staff reapplying for roles into the new structure.
And are there 600? So how many will, for how many jobs? 600 staff reapplying for how many jobs?
Well, as I've said, it's a little more complex.
Right.
Because the 305 number, which is the headline number, right? So that's right. But then there are vacancies, which will be carried over. So at the moment we have 58 vacancies across those areas of work. So those will be carried across. And in addition, there are 27 new jobs. I talked to you before about the fact we're going to do some things differently in Wellington, so visits management. We're going to set up a specialist visits management unit to provide logistical support to our policy teams around visits. We're setting up a focused, specialised ministerial services group to improve the way in which we engage with ministers. So there'll be 27 new jobs in that process.
What implications will it have? What implications will the restructuring have on Māori policy?
Well, the Māori policy unit has been reviewed, as you know, prior to this process. In the consultation document, we are proposing to disestablish the Māori policy unit and to allow Māori policy to be carried across all areas of the ministry, rather than being channeled simply through one single unit. We're also proposing the appointment of a kaumātua for the ministry, the establishment of a cultural support role for Māori, and the review that was undertaken in the Māori Policy Unit identified the need for the ministry to recruit more Māori into the ministry, and that is something that will be actively pursued.
So at the moment you have about 80 Māori employees. How will your jobs be affected?
Well, it will depend where they are in the organisation and what roles they currently have. But as I have said, our Māori employees, in the same way as other employees, if they are in the job families that have been affected by the move from rotation to be non-rotational, will be required to apply into the new jobs that are created.
Right, so essentially you're getting rid of the Māori unit altogether and replacing it with this sort of an advisory kaumātua role.
Well, not just an advisory kaumātua role. What we're saying is we want Māori policy to be actively understood and engaged in by the breadth of the ministry's activities, and we don't want people to be abdicating responsibility for that into a single area. Now, it's a proposal. I have no doubt at all that there will be feedback on that proposal, and I'm aware, as you're aware, that there are very many different models across the public and private sectors. Our ambition is to ensure that we both understand and can support and are connected to Māori. We are particularly, we see a particular focus on Māori business and on the cultural engagement between Māori and peoples of many countries, which both distinguish New Zealand and can enrich New Zealand. So we're looking for opportunity to do that. We're looking for a model that will enable us to do it.
You're talking about these hubs in Europe, so presumably there's going to be some closures. How many closures have you got slated so far, and do you expect further down the track?
We have recommended that we close our embassies in Warsaw and Stockholm. That is the subject of a cabinet decision. It's not our decision to make, and the cabinet have not yet made that decision. But those are the two embassies which we are suggesting are closed, and that is, as you say, consistent with the sort of direction of travel.
Some of the changes you're talking about to changing from rotational and less of a role and status and seniority, it's quite a cultural change for MFAT. How out of touch do you believe the organisation has become? I mean, how out of date were its practices?
I don't think the organisation is out of touch. I mean, the ministry is made up of New Zealanders. We represent New Zealand offshore. We're very connected into the networks of this country. But what I think it is fair to say is that many of our processes have become cumbersome, and that the extent to which we have used what are now conventional technologies and conventional options, such as the sorts of options you've described, hubbing and outsourcing and things of that kind, has been more limited. Similarly, I think it is fair to say that the rotational model is a barrier to developing the depth of expertise which I think is necessary for the ministry to be able to be effective in the future, and that the way that model has been managed to move people around has meant that we haven't seen our young people progress through the organisation as rapidly as either they or we might like.
So has it been wasteful? I mean, have things been completely inefficient?
No, I don't think things have been completely inefficient. I mean, this is a hard-working and well-performing ministry. But what I think our people have been telling us for a number of years now is, while it's not completely inefficient and while we are delivering good results for New Zealand, there are things that we can do better.
305 jobs, does that mean that there have been people sitting around doing nothing? I mean, how is your workload changing to the point that that many jobs need to go, apart from the electronic sort of things that you've mentioned?
Well, as I've described, in part that is about doing work differently, so managing visits, for example, and supporting the logistics of visits through a central agency, managing some of the ministerial connections in that way. In part it is through the technology options that I've just described to you. In part it is taking a more conventional approach to span of control, so it is about looking at how we organise ourselves and making sure that we don't have unnecessary managerial positions that can create sort of blockages in the system. I think it is fair to say that we've been a bit top-heavy as a ministry. Now, that's not to say that people have been sitting around doing nothing, but I think it probably is fair to say that we've had more senior resource than the ministry probably needs.
And you say you wanted to do the consultation so that you could get the views of your staff. If they come back and say, no, we don't agree with what you've proposed, you won't go ahead with it.
Well, I think if they come back and say, no, we don't agree with what you've proposed, what I expect from them, and indeed what I normally get from them, is another phase to that conversation, which is to say, no, we don't agree with what you proposed, and here's some ideas from us about the way in which you can achieve some of the things you talk about. Because our people have been saying to us for ages that we don't manage performance well. Our people have been saying to us for ages that they're not progressing through the organisation fast enough. Our people have been saying to us for ages that learning and development opportunities are really important to them. They want to be able to develop expertise. So, the expectation is that we won't simply get the negative, but we'll get the negative and.
But when
You
you
talked
lose,
about,
that big
you
lose a lot
talked
of
about
expertise.
outsourcing.
Won't you lose a lot of expertise though when you lose 300 people from the organisation?
Well, as I've said, the opportunity is to move people through the organisation more quickly, to take the talent that we have and advance it more quickly. So in my view, I'm very confident that the ministry will continue to have the expertise it needs to be able to deliver for this country.
You may have already answered this, but you talked about outsourcing, and we've seen in the past when the government takes the pruning knife to public service, they do start outsourcing, and these consultants cost more than what the public servants that are being replaced.
Well, the answer to that is in the process that you use and the people that you use to manage and establish those contracts. We have people who are experienced working with us in that space. Many people within the ministry now have experience in outsourcing in the private sector and understand both the pitfalls and opportunities that it represents. Other foreign ministries, the Australian and the UK in particular, have extensive experience in outsourcing and are prepared to work with us on the good and the bad of that. So I'm comfortable that the team that we have in place will deliver a good outcome for us, and I'm comfortable on the information I have currently that outcome will be delivered at a significantly lower cost to the
Will
ministry.
these jobs be outsourced to New Zealand companies or New Zealand individuals?
Some of them will be, some of them, well, I say will be. We aren't in the process where we've selected a particular supplier yet, so we're getting a little ahead of ourselves. But my expectation is that New Zealand suppliers will look to bid into these processes, and obviously we're happy to consider New Zealand suppliers in that
But
process.
What
most
do you
of the
say to
functions are
Chris?
outsourcing overseas, and isn't it more likely that it would be overseas companies that would bid
Look, it
for
depends. It depends. We'd have to have a look and see who actually bids. At the moment, I don't know who's going to bid, so I can't answer the question specifically. All I can say is that we'd be perfectly happy to see New Zealand companies bidding into that process if they thought they had the capability to deliver for us.
But there's
What
a
do
high
you
chance
say?
that these New Zealand jobs will be sourced overseas.
Well, when you say they're New Zealand jobs, very largely they are jobs being done by locally engaged staff in those countries. So most of that supported, the 136 locally engaged staff jobs that I've described, 135, are locals in those particular geographies rather than New Zealanders in those geographies. In terms of the New Zealand impact offshore, there are, as I've said, some impacts in the foreign policy space, particularly in Europe, and there are some impacts on the administrative, what have been the rotational administrative staff that we won't then need offshore.
Is there a danger that in fact you end up sparking an exodus? And if so, have you done any calculations on the likely redundancy bill, have you got a liability figure there in mind?
Well, we are expecting a smaller ministry, so we are expecting, as a consequence of these changes, if the proposals are accepted, that there will be some people who leave the ministry. And of course we've done the calculation of redundancies, we've made a provision, and we'll see whether that provision is in the ballpark.
What do you say to
600
criticism?
staff will have to reapply. What is the total number of staff in the ministry?
If you include all the locally engaged staff, it's about 1,420 off the top of my head.
What do you say to criticism that potential cuts of this magnitude could have an impact on our foreign relationships?
Well, I say first that we are not the only foreign ministry that is looking at these options. So there are many foreign ministries, including many of our closest friends, are exploring exactly
about New Zealand.
Are exploring exactly these sorts of issues. So this is not something we're doing that is unique to us. Second, I'd say that we have the work that has gone into this, led by people of the ministry, people who understand diplomacy, understand those relationships, can give us and give New Zealand some confidence that the solutions that we're proposing will actually enable us to continue to deliver at a foreign policy level.
But let's be blunt, it's about cost cutting, isn't it? I mean, that's what's driving it. We're looking to save money.
No, the answer is that we are as much about changing the culture of the organisation, as much about improving the flexibility of the organisation to be able to respond to shifts and changes that are occurring in a dynamic world, as we are about ensuring that New Zealanders get value for money from the organisation.
Why now then?
You would have made these changes coming in as an outsider. You would have made these sorts of changes even if you hadn't been asked to save tens of millions of dollars.
I'm very clear that our people have been saying to us for years that the technology systems that we've made available to them in the ministry are insufficient for them to be able to deliver as diplomats, that the way in which we manage their careers does not enable them to progress fast enough, that the way in which we manage performance is inadequate. So yes, the short answer is to respond to the concerns that have been raised by people over many years, these changes would be necessary.
And now that there's financial constraints mean that you have to take action.
The financial constraints certainly add an imperative to it, that's right.
Are you cutting into people who are working on free trade agreements?
No, we're not cutting into people who are working on free trade agreements. I'm just trying to think of the numbers. I mean, we recognise, of course, the importance of the free trade agenda for the government, and as I said before, we are applying our resource against those strategic priorities of the government. So there may be some slight reshaping. I just don't have that detail immediately to mind, but we are not cutting in a material way that resource.
Is Stockholm and Warsaw the only two posts, overseas posts that are being closed?
Yes, they are the only two posts that are being recommended for closure. The government haven't yet decided.
How many full-time staff is, rather than the people that work locally for them, how many staff are we talking about?
In those posts, there's only...
No, I mean overall, about your locally engaged staff.
Yeah, so the answer to that was 169.
169 staff.
And will staff, when they reapply for positions, is that going to be the same terms and conditions in their new contract?
It will clearly not be on the same terms and conditions. The terms and conditions will be appointment to role rather than rotational. And the sizing of jobs, the new jobs are different because, as I said, we're doing some of the work that had previously been in those roles in different ways. So jobs will be resized and they will be different in the absence of that rotational piece. They'll also, sorry, just 2 seconds, they'll also be more specialised, if I can say that we are trying to get people to take a more specific look to the way their expertise is being
In terms of conditions,
applied.
I'm talking about things like redundancies provisions, fixed term contracts over sort of like, full-time tenure, those sort of things I'm talking about.
So we have a CEA, and this change program is occurring within that CEA. So the CEA conditions will continue to pertain.
How will the changes impact on our relationship with Pacific nations, and in particular the aid program? Will that be affected in any way?
The answer is that the Pacific is one of our key priority areas. We've talked about trade. The Pacific is obviously another key priority area. The sort of flexibility that we are talking about will actually assist us in the way in which the options available to us in representing ourselves in the Pacific. And if I can give you just one example of that, we've established now a non-resident ambassador based here in Wellington to Tuvalu, which is not a country in which we've had previously a deep representational base. So the sorts of shifts that we are talking about will support our continued presence in the Pacific. In terms specifically of the development assistance capability, the development group have not been part of this specific change program. The reason for that is that they went through their own change program previously when they were reintegrated from being New Zealand Aid to becoming the IDG group within the ministry. And in that process, we reoriented that group around government priorities, particularly in relation to economic development, and changed some of the composition of their workforce. So they haven't been specifically in scope for this entire process.
What is staff morale like given all this uncertainty?
It's pretty challenging in the environment with uncertainty, and as you say, one of the drivers of improving morale is to make it more certain, to make the environment more certain. So getting the consultation document out in front of people, giving them a chance to understand the breadth of measures that we are proposing, giving them a chance to have input into that, I think will go a long way to addressing some of those morale issues. But clearly there is a way to travel yet, but after the decision-making process and then formal implementation.
And how do you feel about it? Presumably you've worked with some of the top heavy managers you're talking about before and the organisation. How do you feel about it?
Well, obviously, in my view, these changes are necessary. In my view, for this ministry to deliver for New Zealand, we have to be using contemporary technology. We have to be using simpler processes. We have to be focusing our resource strategically against the requirements of particular governments. We need to be thinking about different operating models, whether it's outsourcing or whatever it might be. We need to be thinking about different representation models, and most importantly, we need to be thinking about how we're developing our talent and how we're ensuring that that talent has opportunity within this ministry.
You're still talking about a ministry with more than 20% fewer staff, more than 20% fewer staff, and saying that it's going to be delivering a better service. Surely most people will look at that and think it's a bit of a joke.
Well, I wouldn't think so. I think they'll understand that if you focus that resource appropriately, if you build the expertise in that resource, if you give that resource the tools that are necessary to enable them to make a difference, if you provide for them support in an efficient and effective way, that resource can actually deliver a great deal more than if they don't have those things. Just to give you a context, the ministry will be in size in terms of its sort of, New Zealand cohort, the same size as we were in 2007.
In an email to Minister McCulley, an advisor said that there was a lot of mindless, wasteful crap admin at the ministry. Is that fair? Is that what you're thinking?
I haven't seen that document, so I can't comment specifically on it. What I've been saying to you, though, is that there are ways in which we can do those things better. We can manage our administration, we can manage our support, we can enable our workforce far more effectively than we have been in the past.
When you break it all down though, there are 305 jobs that are proposed to go. Wouldn't it be fairer and more honest to your staff just to say, look, this is a cost-cutting message, and more honest to the public as well?
No, I don't think it would be, because frankly, as I said to you before, the drivers of this change are not entirely in cost cutting. The drivers of this change are very much in the culture of the organisation, in the capability of the organisation, and in the careers that we need to provide within the organisation. Now, we also understand that we have to be affordable. So I'm not denying a cost component in our thinking, but that is not the primary driver of these changes.
And the jobs that have been advertised, is that just internally, or are you actually advertising that externally as well?
Most of those jobs will only be advertised internally, and they'll be available first, of course, to affected staff. So they'll be managed through the CEA processes, which require that. Some of the specialist roles that are being reshaped, we will go to the market on, but the primary recruitment pool will be the talented people of the ministry.
Who will start this 24-hour hotline and how qualified will they be?
Well, we're working through how that will be provided with a series of potential providers at the moment.
So it'll be outsourced?
Yeah, outsourced.
It won't be ministry?
No, it would be outsourced.
So how can you guarantee that those people will be given correct advice?
Well, the answer to that is that those sorts of processes are used across multiplicities of organisations. So, this is not new, it's not unique, it's not original. There's no reason why we can't provide those the people who work at that call centre with the information they need in real time to be able to manage and triage those calls. What I'm saying to you is that it will enable us to take the easier, lower intensity engagements away from posts, manage them differently, and recognise that when we do need to deploy a diplomat, then those diplomats can be deployed.
But a Kiwi in distress abroad won't have the option of going through the MC or going through the hotline. They'll have to go through the hotline first. Is that correct?
That would be correct. In the model that we are proposing, they go through the hotline first.
But when you say this
core
isn't
function
unique,
of
though,
diplomatic posts, you don't see them being there to provide assistance for New Zealanders in distress overseas. That's no longer a core function.
No, it absolutely is a core function, but many of the calls that New Zealanders make to our embassies are not when they are in extremis. They're in a whole range of other circumstances that can be quite simply managed in different ways through the processes I've just described. There is no residing from the obligation and desire of this ministry to support New Zealanders who are in trouble offshore. The question is, how do we do that most efficiently and effectively? And frankly, our view is that we will get a better service, New Zealanders will get a better service as a consequence of having access to this call centre than they are currently.
So the call centre will effectively prioritise calls as they come in. High priority ones will go to direct posts and other ones will be managed in different ways.
Correct, that's as we anticipated. I mean, obviously we're in the stage of talking with providers, so I can't give you an
But
answer.
surely that task will be better managed by the Ministry of State.
Well, the question is, can outsourced providers deliver that service? They do for many organisations. We'll see. We're in discussion with them. We think they probably can, but obviously if we're not confident at the end of that process that the service that New Zealanders expect can be delivered, then we won't be progressing.
So
Would it
that's
be
not
New
part of the
Zealand based?
consultation
Would the call
process
centre
that
be
we're
New
already
Zealand
having
based?
discussions with contractors about that. That's already more or less decided.
We previously consulted on the outsource option, so that was in the latter part of last year. So that process has been running contemporaneously with the processes that we're describing here. I'm sorry.
It's just, would the call centre be New Zealand based? And I mean, you're not talking about a utilities company here, you're talking about people who are potentially in a distress situation, trying to ensure they get that help they need quite fast.
So my expectation, I don't know what organisations are applying, but my expectation is that there's capability in New Zealand to be able to provide that service, and clearly what we would prefer to see is a New Zealand voice on the end of the line.
And so will people, when they leave the country, will they have this emergency number on some documentation as they go out so they know who to call?
Yeah, I think that's a very good idea. I mean, in the same way as we encourage people to register when they're offshore with the embassies on that consular facility, that we provide that detail to them.
So the
Folks, we've got about
providers
5 minutes, so just a few more questions.
the providers that you've been talking to and consulting with on this call centre they provide services in what other areas? I mean, is there anyone that is specialising in providing consular services by telephone, or will it be, computer cart service centres or?
Well, look, the answer is that for us to outsource this particular service, we will be confident, we will need to be confident, that the organisation to which we are outsourcing it has the capability to be able to deliver the service that New Zealanders require. If we can't do that, we won't be doing it. But I have to say that every indication that we have at the moment is that there are providers who can provide that service. The benefits to New Zealanders are that they get access to somebody, that they're able to have we're able to triage those calls so that they're dealt with effectively by people, the appropriate people to deal with them. And of course that if they're not in a place where we have an embassy, that they can make contact very efficiently. So we're working through that detail.
So you said you preferred to see, hear a New Zealand voice on the end of the line. So does that mean the providers you're talking to are New Zealanders?
Well, look, I don't want to talk about the specific providers that we're talking to, but I think you can take it that we'd be very pleased if the outcome that came from this, were we to proceed with the outsourcing option, was a New Zealand voice on the end of the line.
Are there data protection and security issues involved in this outsourcing, or would it be a much more generic and ostensibly safe option?
We will manage, the answer to that is we're trying to simplify our processes and make sure that the confidential data that we carry is carried in a different line. So we're looking to simplify it and outsource it, so it will be far more generic in the language that we use. All right, thank you very much.
Thank you.
I think there's some material, I'm not sure, Karen.